The first mention of Bellhouse Orphanage in the town archives comes in the spring of 1901 in a neatly penned announcement in the Weekly Gazette. It was described as a charitable refuge for destitute children, abandoned or left without proper guardianship, an institution meant to shelter the most vulnerable and offer them a fresh start. The building itself was an imposing structure 3 stories of soot-darkened brick, with narrow windows that let in little sunlight and a high, iron fence that seemed more suited for keeping people in than out. Located on the outskirts of Grafton, a coal town that had been clawed into the hillside, Bellhouse stood apart from the modest homes and shops of Main Street. To approach it, one had to follow a winding, rutted road through a stretch of barren trees that seemed to grow more twisted the closer one came. Even in its earliest days, visitors noted an unsettling quiet that hung in the air there, as though the very earth had learned to muffle sound. It opened under the management of a woman named Margaret Bellhouse, a matron in her mid-40s, whose name matched the building by coincidence, or so she claimed. She was not from Grafton, and never spoke of where she had lived before. She had the air of someone both gentle and unyielding, the sort who could cradle a child with one hand while closing a ledger with the other. Townsfolk who met her said she had an uncanny way of looking through you, as if she were weighing something invisible on a set of scales only she could see. The orphanage began with 22 children, most brought in from neighboring counties. They were clothed, fed, and taught basic reading and arithmetic. A few townspeople volunteered their time, helping in the classrooms or delivering goods. Yet, despite the air of benevolence the Gazette painted, not many lingered long once inside. The atmosphere was heavy, the rooms dim, and a strange, faint odor somewhere between damp stone and singed hair clung to the hallways. That first winter, one of the children died. An 8-year-old girl named Eleanor was found pale and still in her bed one icy morning. The town doctor listed winter fever on her death certificate, the term then used for a broad range of seasonal illnesses. Margaret Bellhouse attended the funeral herself, standing with folded hands as the coffin was lowered into the frozen ground. By the following winter, there were 4 more deaths. Always children, always the same story: fever, coughing, exhaustion, consumption, the doctor would say. The turn of the century was still an era when such losses were common, especially in places where poverty lingered. Yet there was something about the pattern, the speed with which illness claimed them, the absence of any spread among the other children, that left a quiet unease in some corners of Grafton. But the unease never grew into accusation. The Bellhouse Orphanage was, after all, a charitable institution. The matron's presence at every funeral, her steady gaze and her soft assurances that she had done all she could, these things dulled suspicion. The people wanted to believe she was doing good work. It was easier than imagining something else. By 1905, the number of graves in the orphanage's small plot had grown to 17. The deaths came mostly in the cold months, and they did not discriminate between the youngest toddlers and the older children on the cusp of adolescence. A few laborers who dug the graves claimed the earth there felt oddly warm, even in winter. But such remarks were brushed off as idle talk. It wasn't until much later, long after the building had been abandoned, after the doors had been chained shut and the windows boarded, that anyone would uncover what was hidden beneath the careful facade. A journal, bound in cracked leather, tucked deep into a false compartment in the matron's quarters. Its pages were dense with tight, slanted handwriting. The journal was not a record of the orphanage's operations. It was something else entirely, a ledger of names, dates, and symbols that no one in town could decipher at first. Every child who had died was listed, their names underlined in a pale brown ink that had once been red. Alongside them were strange diagrams, circles intersecting lines, clusters of symbols that seemed to twist into each other the longer one looked at them. The entry spoke of preparations and offerings, of alignments that had to be met. The illnesses mentioned in the death certificates appeared here as chosen nights and marks received. There were references to something simply called the gate, and notes on the importance of timing the coldest hours. Of the coldest days, the handwriting grew more frantic toward the later years. As if the author had been racing to complete something before a deadline no one else could see. It would take decades, and the patient work of a historian who had stumbled across the journal in the town's archives to piece together what those entries truly meant. By then, the children's graves had long been covered with weeds, and the iron fence around the property had rusted into jagged fragments. But in 1901, the story was just beginning. The town saw an orphanage and a matron. They saw a place that took in the forgotten. They did not yet see the pattern beneath the deaths, the cold arithmetic behind the compassion. The first chapter of the Bellhouse Orphanage's history was one of quiet trust, a trust that would, over the next 11 years, be slowly poisoned until there was nothing left but the memory of small coffins lowered into the ground. By the turn of 1903, Bellhouse Orphanage had become a fixture in Grafton. Its dark brick silhouette stood like a permanent shadow on the edge of town, a place most people spoke of with reluctant respect, but seldom visited without reason. In public, the matron maintained her image of unshakable devotion. She appeared in church on Sundays, wearing a modest black dress and a simple hat, and donated to the parish out of the orphanage's modest funds. Yet behind the walls of Bellhouse, the atmosphere was shifting in subtle, unsettling ways. The children rarely ventured into town. When they did, they moved in pairs or small groups, always under the watch of one of the senior attendants. Their faces were pale, their voices low, and their clothes, though neatly mended, were of drab, muted colors. Town merchants who saw them at the bakery or grocer would later remark that the children's eyes seemed tired in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. There were whispers, of course. The laundress who came once a week claimed she sometimes found odd stains on the bedding stains, too dark for illness and too thick for ink. The milkman once mentioned that when he made his early deliveries, he heard faint humming from inside, not the playful singing of children, but something lower, slower, and strangely patterned. Few took these remarks seriously, but they lodged in the town's collective memory like splinters. Margaret Bellhouse kept her own counsel. She rarely allowed outsiders into certain parts of the building, claiming those areas were under repair or unsuitable for visitors. The cellar was strictly off limits to anyone but her and the handyman, an aging man named Alcott, who had once worked in the mines. He was a quiet, stooped figure who came and went without speaking to the children. When asked about the cellar, he would mutter that it was best left as it is, and change the subject. In late January of that year, 2 more children died within days of each other. The official cause was, again, winter fever. The doctor, a man whose eyesight had been failing for years, signed the certificates without a second thought. This brought the orphanage's death toll to 9 in just over 2 years. The townsfolk murmured about the misfortune, but as always, Margaret Bellhouse's composed presence seemed to quiet their unease. Privately, however, there were those who began to keep count. A gravedigger named Finn O'Malley, who had dug most of the children's graves, started keeping a list in a small notebook. He noticed the dates were not random. The deaths often occurred just before the new moon or during the coldest nights of the year. He shared his observations with a few others over drinks at the tavern, but the talk was dismissed as superstition. Still, O'Malley kept writing. What no one in Grafton knew was that Margaret Bellhouse's journal had grown steadily in content. The pages for 1903 were filled with notations about phases and thresholds, alongside intricate drawings of shapes made from overlapping circles. Certain entries contained descriptions of the children, never their personalities, but always their physical attributes: hair color, birthmarks, scars. Some were marked with symbols beside their names, as if each one served a particular purpose. In February, a heavy snowstorm trapped the orphanage in isolation for 3 days. No deliveries came, no visitors arrived. When the roads finally cleared, the milkman reported that he saw no smoke from the chimneys, yet the snow on the roof had melted in a perfect ring around the building. This oddity was quietly forgotten, chalked up to the heat of the upper floors, but those who passed by in the evenings swore they saw candlelight flickering in the upper windows well past midnight. One particular event that year would leave a quiet but lasting mark on the town's memory. In the summer of 1903, the orphanage held its first public fair, a fundraising event meant to gather donations. Tables were set up with baked goods, handmade crafts, and knitted scarves. The children were instructed to smile and greet visitors, though many did so with a stiffness that seemed rehearsed. It was during this fair that a local schoolteacher, Miss Abigail Crane, noticed something peculiar. Several of the children bore faint, identical marks on the skin just above their wrists. They were small, circular, and evenly spaced, as if made by a heated instrument. She asked one of the attendants about them, only to be told they were old insect bites. Yet the shapes were too uniform, the placement too precise. Miss Crane mentioned it to the town doctor later that week, but he waved it off, distracted by other matters. Still, she could not shake the image of those pale, thin wrists bearing the same darkened ring. She would recall it years later, when the truth about Bellhouse came to light. By year's end, the death toll had risen again. The graves in the orphanage's small plot were beginning to form neat, even rows. A few of the townspeople started avoiding the road that led past the property, preferring longer routes to reach the farmlands beyond. There was something about the way the orphanage seemed to loom over the road, its dark windows watching. Margaret Bellhouse continued her work with unshakable precision. She attended church, balanced the accounts, wrote polite thank-you notes to donors, and kept her journal locked away in her quarters. To the town, she remained the unflappable matron who had devoted her life to caring for the unwanted. But to those children within the iron fence, life had narrowed into a quiet, oppressive routine. A sound of footsteps in the hallway after midnight brought a unique kind of dread, for it was never certain whether they would stop at your door, pass you by. And as winter settled once again over Grafton, the pattern prepared to repeat itself. The winter of 1904 settled over Grafton like a heavy shroud. Snow gathered in deep drifts along the roadsides, weighing down the skeletal branches of the trees. The river froze at its edges, and the town seemed to move at half its usual pace. But within the walls of Bellhouse Orphanage, the cold took on a different kind of presence, one that did not always follow the weather outside. By now, 19 graves lined the orphanage's burial plot. The deaths had been steady, almost rhythmic, each winter claiming its share. The people of Grafton, though they did not speak of it openly, had begun to associate the sight of the matron walking toward town with bad news. She always came alone, always to see the doctor or the undertaker, and always returned the same way, slow, measured, untroubled. Inside Bellhouse, the children lived by strict order. The days began before dawn with morning chores, followed by lessons in reading, scripture, and arithmetic. Meals were plain, the portions modest. The evenings were the most unsettling, for once darkness fell, the building seemed to change. Candles replaced the daylight in most rooms, their glow casting elongated shadows on the walls. The air seemed heavier then, and an unnatural stillness settled over the dormitories. Several of the older children, those who had been there for years, had developed the habit of marking the days on scraps of paper hidden under their mattresses. It wasn't a countdown toward any freedom, for they had no real expectation of leaving. Instead, it was a way to track the patterns they sensed but couldn't explain. They had noticed that on certain nights, the matron and two attendants would make their way silently down to the cellar, carrying small wooden boxes. The next day, the orphanage would be quieter than usual, as though some invisible weight had passed through the halls. No one outside those walls knew that the cellar beneath Bellhouse was far larger than the plans filed with the town. It extended into the earth in a network of narrow, stone-lined chambers. At its center was a room where the floor was inlaid with a large, circular design carved directly into the stone, its grooves darkened with age and something far older than the orphanage itself. The boxes carried down on those nights contained objects never recorded in any inventory, objects whose purpose would only make sense in the context of the journal hidden in the matron's quarters. That year, the first death came earlier than usual. In mid-December, a boy named Robert, barely 7 years old, was found lifeless in his bed. The doctor arrived, his breath frosting in the cold air as he examined the body, and once again wrote winter fever on the certificate. Something about Robert's appearance troubled the undertaker. The boy's skin bore a faint, pale ring just above his collarbone, perfectly circular and without any sign of irritation. It was almost invisible unless the light caught it just right. The undertaker mentioned it to the matron, but she dismissed it as a mark from the child's shirt collar. In the weeks that followed, 2 more children died, both within days of the new moon. This coincidence went unnoticed by most, except for Finn O'Malley, the gravedigger who had been keeping his quiet list. He now had columns for names, dates, and lunar phases, and the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Yet he told no one, unsure of how to speak the thought aloud without sounding like a man who had lost his mind. It was during this bitter winter that a small but telling incident occurred, one that would only seem important in hindsight. A merchant delivering coal to the orphanage claimed he saw strange markings in the snow near the cellar doors. They were not footprints, but elongated impressions, as though something had been dragged or had dragged itself across the ground. The marks led from the cellar entrance toward the tree line and then disappeared. He mentioned it to Olcott, the handyman, who told him the snow had played tricks on his eyes. The next morning, a fresh snowfall covered everything, and the evidence was gone. By March, the snow began to melt, and with it came the smell of damp earth rising from the orphanage grounds. For most of Grafton, the thaw signaled the approach of spring, but for Bellhouse, the season's change brought a quiet unease. Those who worked in the building could feel it in the air, as though the walls themselves were waiting for something. The journal in the matron's quarters reflected this shift. Her entries for early 1904 mentioned the thawing and the opening beneath. She wrote of preparations complete and the circle's alignment, phrases that would later trouble anyone who read them. The last death of that season came in late April, just as the frost gave way to damp mornings. This child, an 11-year-old named Thomas's, was buried quickly, without the usual funeral service. The matron claimed it was to spare the other children from illness, but some suspected it was because of the state of his body. Those who had seen him before burial whispered of the same faint mark above the collarbone, only darker this time, almost burned into the skin. After that, the orphanage went through several months without a loss. Summer brought longer days, and with them a temporary reprieve from the pattern of winter deaths. But this quiet was not the peace it seemed. For within the walls of Bellhouse, something was building a careful, deliberate progression, like steps in a design only the matron fully understood. To the town, Bellhouse remained what it had always been, a home for the unwanted, a place of charity. But for those inside, it was a place where the air felt heavy even in the heat of summer, and where the sound of footsteps in the cellar could make the heart race in ways no illness ever could. The summer of 1905 settled hot and slow over Grafton, but Bellhouse Orphanage seemed immune to the season's warmth. The building's thick stone walls trapped the chill of the earth, and the air inside retained that faint, dry mustiness that clung to old wood and older secrets. Even in July, the children slept under blankets, though they did not always complain. The cold was a comfort compared to the nights when it wasn't just the temperature that kept them awake. During the day, the sound of cicadas filled the air around the orphanage. From the windows of the upper floors, the children could see dust drifting up from the dirt road where wagons passed by toward town. To them, these fleeting glimpses of the outside world were small reminders that life went on beyond Bellhouse's iron gates. The town's laughter and music carried faintly on the summer breeze, distant and unreachable. The matron kept her schedule as rigid as ever, her presence cutting through the lazy summer atmosphere like a knife. Her black dresses seemed almost too heavy for the heat, yet she wore them without sign of discomfort. The attendants, too, worked with quiet precision, as though the warmth was nothing more than an illusion meant for other people. It was during this summer lull that one of the older boys, Samuel Wright, began to notice something the others hadn't. In the evenings, after the day's lessons and chores were complete, he would see the matron at her desk, writing in a small leather-bound book. She would lean close to the page, her pen moving in deliberate strokes, occasionally pausing to dip the nib into the inkwell before continuing. Once or twice, Samuel had passed the open door of her office and glimpsed strange symbols in the margins, not letters or numbers, but intricate shapes that curled and knotted into themselves like vines. Samuel had been at Bellhouse long enough to understand the unspoken rule: you did not ask the matron questions. But curiosity is not easily suppressed, especially when it grows in the mind of a child who has little else to hold on to. Over the course of several weeks, he began to notice that on nights when she wrote more than usual, the orphanage seemed quieter, too quiet. Even the creaking of the beams and the wind pressing against the shutters seemed to fade. The other children slept more restlessly on those nights, shifting in their beds as though caught in uneasy dreams. Meanwhile, outside the orphanage, the town of Grafton prepared for its annual midsummer fair. Stalls were set up along the main street, selling roasted corn, ribbons, and small trinkets. Musicians tuned their instruments, and the smell of baked goods drifted on the air. But for the first time in years, a matron allowed no children to attend, not even the older ones who usually went to help with deliveries or errands. Her reasoning was simple: we are behind in our studies. Finn O'Malley, the gravedigger, noticed her absence from the fair and found it troubling. She had always made an appearance in years past, if only to make small talk with the undertaker or the priest. This year, she had sent one of her attendants into town for supplies instead. That same week, Finn saw a covered wagon arrive at Bellhouse at dusk, its driver a stranger. The wagon stayed for less than an hour before departing empty in the attic. Of the orphanage, dust gathered thick on the floorboards, disturbed only by the occasional flutter of pigeons that had found their way in through a broken pane. The attic was strictly off limits to the children, but Samuel had discovered a loose panel in the hallway outside the boys' dormitory that led into the narrow crawl space above. From there, he could peer into the attic through a gap in the boards. It was here, one late August evening, that he saw the matron and two attendants carrying a heavy crate toward a far corner. They set it down with deliberate care, then covered it with a black cloth. Whatever was inside, Samuel never saw. But that night, he heard the low hum of voices through the floor above his bed. It was not the sound of conversation, more like a rhythm, a slow and steady cadence that did not waver. He could not make out the words, but the tone filled him with a strange heaviness that lingered until morning. The summer passed without a single death, but the children sensed that the quiet was not a kindness. It was a pause. They had learned by now that Bellhouse moved in cycles, and with each turn of the year, something unseen pressed closer. The matron's journal, had anyone been able to read it, would have revealed entries from those warm months describing the drawing inward and the storing of vessels. She wrote of the air thickening, the circle sleeping, and the importance of readiness before the frost returned. When autumn arrived, it did so suddenly, as if the warmth had been pulled from the land in a single breath. The leaves fell quickly. The days shortened, and a thin film of ice began forming on the water trough outside. The change brought a tension that hung over Bellhouse like a shadow. It was the kind of tension that made the children flinch at sudden noises, and made even the most loyal attendants glance toward the cellar stairs with unease. The first frost of the year came in late October, and with it came the first child, too. Fall ill. A girl named Anna, pale and fevered, was moved to a bed in the infirmary. The matron spent long hours by her side, but not in the way of a nurse. There was no spoon-feeding of broth, no gentle cloths against the forehead. Instead, the matron sat perfectly still in the chair beside the bed, her eyes fixed on the girl's face as though waiting for something unseen. By the second week of November, Anna was gone. The death certificate, once again, read winter fever. But Samuel noticed the faint ring on her neck as she was carried away, the same as Robert, the same as Thomas. Whatever the matron was waiting for that summer, it had arrived. And this time, it had not come alone. The ground froze early that year, hard as iron before December had even begun. In Grafton, the farmers cursed their luck. The frost had claimed the last of the root vegetables still in the ground, and the livestock huddled miserably in the barns. But at Bellhouse Orphanage, the cold was something else entirely. It seemed to deepen inside the walls, seeping through stone and floorboards, until it clung to the skin like a damp shroud. Samuel began waking in the night to a sound he could not place a faint scraping, like nails or metal dragging against wood. Sometimes it came from the attic, other times from the cellar, but always in that same slow, deliberate rhythm. It was never loud, but it wormed its way into his thoughts. Even in daylight, the infirmary filled quickly that winter. First Anna, then Peter, then two of the younger girls, Ruth and Eliza. Each was taken from the dormitory at night and placed in one of the narrow beds along the far wall. Curtains were drawn between the sick and the rest of the room, but no one needed to see to know how things would end. Within days, their coughs would fade, replaced by a silence far heavier than the sound of illness. The matron oversaw these deaths with the same detached focus she always had, but there was something new in her movements, something that suggested. Each loss was not merely endured, but required. On more than one occasion, Samuel noticed her leaving the infirmary with a small glass vial in hand. Its contents were dark, almost black, and she kept it tucked close to her chest as she moved swiftly toward the cellar stairs. Outside, the snow piled higher each week. The iron gates stood buried to their lower rungs, and the road to town became little more than a narrow trench carved by the passage of wagons. Few visitors came, and those who did never stayed long. The townsfolk whispered about the growing number of graves in the churchyard, but their words carried no further than the tavern doors. Death in winter was expected, though perhaps not quite so often as this. One afternoon in late January, Finn O'Malley arrived at the orphanage with his cart. He had come to collect the small coffin prepared for Eliza, but before he could load it, he spotted something strange. The lid had not yet been nailed shut, and in the dim light of the hall, Finn thought he saw a thin string tied around the child's wrist, disappearing under the folds of the shroud. He hesitated only a moment before the matron's attendant closed the lid and gestured for him to carry on. By the time Finn thought to ask about it, The door had been shut behind him. That night, Samuel awoke to find the dormitory colder than usual, the kind of cold that bites at the bones. The other boys were restless, shifting under their blankets. Then came the hum again, the low, rhythmic murmur that had haunted him before. But this time, it was joined by a faint metallic clink, like chains brushing against stone. The sound seemed to rise from the floor beneath his bed. Driven by a mix of fear and resolve, Samuel slipped from under his blanket and crept toward the loose panel in the wall. The crawl space above the attic had given him a vantage point before. Perhaps now he could find the source of the noise. The boards were colder than ice as he crawled across them, his breath a thin cloud in the dark. Peering through the gap, he saw the attic dimly lit by a single lantern. The matron stood at the center of a chalk circle drawn on the floor, its lines thick and precise. Around her were the attendants, each holding one of those small glass vials. They were pouring the contents into shallow brass bowls arranged along the circle's edge. The dark liquid glistened like oil in the flickering light. The hum grew louder, and Samuel felt it in his chest, as though the air itself was vibrating. Then the matron raised her hands, and the attendants stopped. A silence fell, broken only by the faint hiss of the lantern flame. From the far corner of the attic, something shifted beneath a black cloth. Slowly, deliberately, the matron crossed the circle and pulled the covering aside. Samuel's eyes widened, not at what he saw, but at what he didn't. The crate he had glimpsed in summer was gone, replaced by a wooden frame draped in what looked like skin. It was stretched taut, translucent, and beneath it was movement shadows, writhing like smoke trapped in a jar. The matron's voice broke the silence, her words low and steady, speaking in a language Samuel had never heard. The shadows writhed, harder, pressing against the stretched surface as if they sought to escape. One of the brass bowls tipped slightly, spilling some of the dark liquid onto the floor. The shadows froze, then began moving toward it. Samuel scrambled backward in the crawl space, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it would give him away. He didn't stop until he was back in his bed, pulling the blanket tight around himself. He lay there until dawn, eyes wide, certain that the cold in the room was no longer just the work of winter, not the next day. The matron's journal gained a new entry. 4 completed, the circle strengthened. Vessel restless, but contained. The 5th will come soon. And it did. A thaw never came that February. The sky remained a dull, unbroken gray, and the wind carried the dry sting of powdered snow that never seemed to melt. In town, people muttered about how the winter felt wrong, as though something in the air was holding spring at bay. Up on the hill, Bellhouse Orphanage stood like a tombstone against the horizon, its windows reflecting nothing but the dim light of the day. Samuel had stopped sleeping through the night entirely. Even when the strange humming didn't wake him, he found himself staring into the dark, listening for the faint scrape of metal, the shifting floorboards, the breaths of children who, by morning, might be gone. He kept replaying what he'd seen in the attic, those bowls, that skin-like frame, the restless shadows moving beneath it, and the image pressed itself deeper into his mind until it was almost part of him. The 5th death came in the form of Ruth's little brother Thomas. He had been pale for weeks, listless in the cold, and then one night the attendants came and carried him away. Samuel overheard one whisper to the other that the moon was right, though neither explained what that meant. By morning, the bed was stripped, the blanket neatly folded at the foot, and Thomas was gone. The day after Thomas disappeared, Samuel decided he had to see the matron's journal for himself. He had glimpsed it once before, black leather, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, with its corners worn smooth from years of handling. She kept it close at all times, usually tucked into her apron pocket, but sometimes she left it on her desk while meeting with visitors. That afternoon, Fortune or fate seemed to grant Samuel an opening. The matron had been called to the gate to speak with Reverend Dalloway, who had braved the snow to bring another cartload of blankets from the church. Samuel slipped into her office, his feet silent on the worn rug. The room smelled of wax and something acrid he couldn't place. The journal sat in the center of the desk, beside a cap ink bottle and a stack of letters tied with twine. His fingers trembled as he opened it. The handwriting was small, almost cramped. The ink faded in places. It wasn't a diary of daily events. It was a ledger. Each page listed dates, names, and short notations in a mixture of English and some other language. The most recent entries were chilling in their precision. Thomas Weaver. 5th completed. Vessel stronger. Alignment approaching. Flipping back, Samuel saw the names of Anna, Peter, Ruth, and Eliza, each marked with completed, and followed by a similar note about the vessel. Earlier pages contained dozens more names, each one belonging to a child who had died. At Bellhouse over the past decade, not a single cause of death was listed. In the margins were symbol circles intersected by lines, crude stars, spirals that seemed to pull the eye inward. Samuel didn't know their meaning, but he felt instinctively that they were not meant for children's eyes. One symbol in particular appeared again and again, a ring of 13 points with a crescent moon etched in the center. He turned another page and froze. This one wasn't an entry. It was a diagram. At first, it looked like a rough sketch of the attic floor, but then he realized it matched exactly what he had seen. The chalk circle, the brass bowls, the frame with its translucent covering. Around it were notes in that other language, and beneath the drawing, a single line in English. The vessel must be fed before the thaw, or it will take what it chooses. A floorboard creaked behind him. Samuel snapped the book shut and turned to see one of the attendants, Miss Harrow, standing in the doorway. Her face betrayed no emotion, but her eyes lingered on the journal in his hands for one heartbeat too long. Then she stepped inside, her movements smooth, deliberate. "The matron will see you now," she said. Samuel slid the journal back onto the desk, careful to place it exactly as he'd found it. As Miss Harrow ushered him out, he could feel her gaze on the back of his neck. She did not take him to the matron, nor anywhere near her. Instead, she steered him toward the dormitory, her voice flat as she said, "You should keep your nose out of places it doesn't belong, Samuel. Not every question deserves an answer." That night, the hum in the walls came again, louder than before. Samuel tried to block it out, but the sound seemed to curl through his mind like smoke. In his half-sleep, he thought he heard Thomas's voice, calling from somewhere deep below the floorboards, not crying, but whispering, almost beckoning. When morning came, the snow outside had deepened. The road completely vanished beneath white drifts. The children were kept indoors all day. The matron did not appear at meals, and when she did emerge in the evening, Samuel noticed a faint red stain at the cuff of her apron. In the ledger of his memory, the words from her journal etched themselves. Deeper, before the thaw, or it will take what it chooses. Somehow, Samuel knew that it was already awake. The blizzard hit that night. Not a gentle snowfall or the lazy drift of winter flurries, but a suffocating wall of white that buried the orphanage in silence. The wind screamed against the shutters, rattling the glass like bony fingers trying to pry their way in. Inside, the air felt thick, as if the storm had sealed Bellhouse away from the rest of the world, turning it into a floating island in a sea of snow. The matron moved through the halls like a shadow, her face unreadable, her eyes brighter than the lamplight. She spoke little, issuing orders to Miss Harrow and the other attendants in clipped murmurs. Meals were meager thin broth, hard bread, and the water in the buckets froze at the edges before the children could drink it. On the Second night of the storm, Samuel woke to a sound different from the humming in the walls. This was lower, almost a growl, resonating from beneath the floor. It came in short bursts, as though something vast was shifting in the dark. Then came a muffled thud, followed by a strange, wet slither. The noises stopped as quickly as they began, leaving only the sigh of the wind. Samuel tried to sleep again, but his mind kept circling the matron's words from the journal. The vessel must be fed before the thaw. He thought of the attic, the circle of bowls, the translucent skin stretched over the frame. Was the vessel something they were building, or something they were keeping alive? The answer came the following evening. The storm had eased just enough for the moon to pierce through the clouds, flooding the hallways with pale light. The attendants gathered the children into the great room, telling them they would sleep there for warmth. But Samuel noticed that certain children, those who were quieter, thinner, perhaps weaker, were placed together on one side of the room, while the rest were told to lie opposite. The matron counted them twice. When the lamps were extinguished and the room sank into darkness, Samuel stayed awake. His eyes adjusted enough to see shapes moving near the door: Miss Harrow, another attendant, and finally the matron herself. They carried no lamps, but the moonlight revealed their faces. Calm, focused, almost reverent, the group moved to the far side of the room where the weaker children slept. Samuel saw them lift Ruth Frail, trembling in her sleep, into their arms. Another child followed, then a third. The matron led the way, the hem of her dress whispering over the floorboards. They slipped out into the hallway without a sound. Samuel waited until they were gone before rising. No one stopped him. No one even stirred. He crept after them, peeping, to the shadows. The orphanage at night was a maze of dim corridors and yawning doorways. The only light came from the moon glinting on the snow outside. They weren't heading toward the attic. Instead, they descended the narrow servants' stairs, deeper and deeper, past the basement storage rooms, and into a section Samuel had never seen before. The air here was damp, heavy, and smelled faintly metallic, like old coins or blood. From the bottom of the staircase, a corridor stretched into darkness. The walls were lined with bricks slick with moisture, and the floor sloped slightly downward, as though leading into the earth itself. Samuel followed at a distance, heart pounding in his ears. At the far end, the matron opened a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. Beyond it, Samuel glimpsed a cavernous chamber lit by dozens of candles. The walls were painted with the same symbols from her journal: spirals, circles, and the ring of 13 points crowned by the crescent moon. In the center of the floor was a pit, ringed with stone, from which the low growl now emerged in steady rhythm. The attendants laid the children beside the pit. The matron knelt, her hands moving in deliberate patterns in the air, tracing the shapes of the symbols as she whispered in that same foreign tongue Samuel had seen in the ledger. The growl deepened, and something inside the pit shifted. The movement was not human. It was too large, too fluid, too silent for a body of flesh and bone. Samuel's stomach turned as a glistening shape rose into view. It was impossible to tell if it had limbs or a face. It seemed to be made of shadow and membrane, glistening like wet skin under the candlelight. It hovered just above the lip of the pit, pulsing as though breathing. The matron's voice grew louder, more insistent. One of the attendants took Ruth by the arms and lifted her toward the thing in the pit. Her eyes opened briefly, but they were glassy, unfocused, drugged. The shadowy form extended something like a limb, wrapping around her with sickening slowness, and then it drew her inside itself. There was no scream, no struggle, only the faintest sigh, like wind through dry grass. Samuel clapped a hand over his mouth to stop himself from crying out. One by one, the chosen children were given to the thing in the pit. Each time, It seemed to grow denser, its form more defined, as if their bodies were giving it shape. The matron watched with a calm that chilled Samuel's blood. When the final child was gone, she placed her hands on the edge of the stone ring, whispered something, and the shadow slid back into the darkness below. The candles were snuffed. The iron-banded door slammed shut. Footsteps retreated up the corridor. Samuel stayed hidden in the dark long after they were gone, the silence pressing against him like a weight dot. Now he understood. Bellhouse wasn't just a place where children died. It was a place where they were fed to something that should never have been woken. And spring was coming. The days after the blizzard felt wrong in a way that went deeper than cold. The storm had passed. The sun returned in thin, weak arcs across the frozen sky. But the air inside Bellhouse was still heavy with the echoes of that night. The missing children were not mentioned. There were no questions, no explanations. Their beds were simply stripped, their belongings folded away, and their names never spoken again. For the rest, life resumed in its strange, mechanical rhythm. Meals at precise hours, chores completed under watchful eyes, prayers muttered in hushed tones before sleep. But Samuel noticed something. The matron walked lighter now, almost satisfied. She would pause by the windows more often, gazing at the snow with a faint smile, as though counting down the days to something only she understood. Samuel barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the pit again, the glistening membrane, the slow pull of shadow swallowing small, limp bodies. The sound it made lingered in his ears, not a growl, but a kind of hunger breathing. He needed proof. Not for the other children, they were too afraid or too indoctrinated to believe him, but for himself. The truth had to be more than the image in his mind. He decided he would find a way into that chamber during the day. The opportunity came, sooner than he expected. One afternoon, while the older boys were sent to shovel paths through the snow, Samuel slipped away. He moved quickly down the servants' stairs, listening for footsteps. The deeper he descended, the damper the air became, until his breath came out in little clouds. The corridor at the bottom was dim, lit only by the faint spill of daylight. From a small grate above Dot, the iron-banded door loomed ahead. It was locked, but the wood was old, and the stone around it uneven. Samuel ran his fingers along the wall, feeling for gaps. Near the floor, beneath a layer of grime, he found a narrow opening, just wide enough for a child to squeeze through if they pressed flat. He slid onto his stomach, pushed his shoulders into the gap, and wriggled forward. The stone scraped his ribs. His coat caught on a splinter, but then he was through. The chamber was colder than the corridor. Without the candles, it felt cavernous, its edges lost in shadow. The painted symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer faintly, as though the pigments themselves had soaked in something alive. In the center, the pit yawned like a wound in the earth. Samuel edged closer. The stone ring was smooth, worn by years of hands resting on it during whatever rituals took place here. He peered over the side. Dot at first. He saw only darkness. Then movement a slow, coiling ripple far below, like ink swirling in water. Something shifted upward. A membrane, translucent and pale, caught what little light there was, and beneath it, veins pulsed faintly. The thing wasn't sleeping. It was waiting. A sound rose from below, faint but deliberate, a soft tapping, like knuckles against wood. Then another, closer together, then faster, until it became a rhythm. Samuel realized with sick certainty that it was mimicking a heartbeat. He stumbled back from the edge, but his foot caught on something. He turned to see a bundle of cloth small dresses, shirts, tiny boots, all tied together with twine. He untied the knot, hands shaking. Inside were trinkets, hair ribbons, carved wooden animals, a cracked porcelain doll's head. The missing children's belongings hidden here discarded like shed skins. A sudden noise froze him. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed in the corridor outside. Samuel stuffed the bundle back together and scrambled toward the gap in the wall, sliding through just as the iron door creaked open. He pressed himself into the shadows, peering through the opening. The matron entered, alone. She moved to the pit and placed both hands on the stone rim. Her voice filled the room, low and steady, in that strange language again. The shadows below shifted in response. She reached into her apron and withdrew something small, a black bird, still alive, its wings bound. With a swift, almost tender motion, she dropped it into the pit. The thing caught it before it could fall more than a few feet. The sound it made, soft, wet, sent a shiver through Samuel's spine. The matron lingered, murmuring to it, before turning and leaving. The door closed. The footsteps retreated. Samuel didn't move until he could no longer hear her. He crept back up the stairs, his mind burning with the certainty that whatever was in that pit was growing stronger. The bird was only a token. The real feast had already been given to it during the storm. And if the matron's words in her journal were true, the thaw would bring something worse. That night, as the orphanage slept, Samuel lay awake, listening to the faint hum in the walls. He realized now it wasn't the building settling, nor the wind through cracks. It was the thing beneath them, breathing through the stones, testing the air, waiting for spring to break the ice. By late February, the snow began to retreat in slow, wet patches, leaving behind black soil and the slick, rotting stench of things long buried. The children grew restless, staring out windows as though something in the thaw called to them. Even the smallest ones seemed distant, their eyes following nothing in particular, yet fixed on a point far beyond the walls. Samuel felt it too, not the pull, but the pressure. The air seemed heavier, like the entire orphanage had been dragged few inches deeper into the earth. The humming in the walls was no longer faint. It had developed a pulse, in rhythm with the matron's morning prayers. She had begun wearing a necklace that Samuel had never seen before, an iron key dangling from a chain of bone beads. It rested against her chest at all times, even while she served porridge, and her fingers often found it, tracing the edges as though it were more talisman than tool. He kept his distance, biding his time, but the urgency gnawed at him. If the journal was right, something called the offering of thaw was only weeks away, timed for the first full moon after the ice on the pond melted. The ritual in January had been in preparation. This one sounded like a release. Samuel needed help. He approached only one person, Margaret, the oldest girl in the orphanage. She was quiet, sharp-eyed, and had an odd immunity to the matron's smile. Over the years, she'd watched too many beds be stripped, too many names vanish. She listened without interrupting as he told her what he had seen, the pit, the shifting thing, the belongings of the missing. When he finished, she didn't tell him he was mad. She simply said, "Then we have to see what she keeps in her room." That night, they crept from their beds. The matron's quarters were on the second floor, just above the entrance hall, the door heavy and usually locked. But Samuel had noticed she sometimes left the key in the door when summoned suddenly. He had also noticed that the lock itself, though old, was stubborn only when turned slowly. They reached her door and paused, listening. No sound from within. Margaret tried the handle. It turned. The room smelled faintly of burnt herbs and something metallic. A single candle burned low on the desk, surrounded by open ledgers and scraps of parchment filled with the same curling script from the journal. But what drew Samuel's eyes was the wall opposite the bed, an entire section covered in pinned photographs, sketches, and scraps of children's clothing. Some were labeled with dates in red ink, others with strange symbols matching those in the basement. On the desk lay a shallow wooden box. Inside were small glass vials, each holding a cloudy liquid. Their cork stoppers were sealed with wax, and each vial bore a names Samuel recognized. Names of the missing. Margaret picked one up and held it to the candlelight. Something drifted inside the murk, like ash or strands of hair dot in the bottom drawer. They found a folded piece of parchment heavier than the rest. Margaret spread it on the desk. It was a map, not of the orphanage, but of the land beneath it. At the center, a large inked circle marked the mall, with branching tunnels radiating outward like roots. A note at the edge read, "The ice binds it. The thaw loosens it. The offering strengthens it." A floorboard creaked behind them. They turned. The matron stood in the doorway, the iron key around her neck catching the candlelight. Her face was unreadable, neither angry nor surprised. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a slow, deliberate motion. Her eyes moved from Margaret to Samuel, then to the open drawer. She didn't speak. Instead, she crossed the room and took the map from the desk, folding it with careful precision. Samuel's heart pounded, waiting for the shout, the punishment, the sudden violent grip on his collar. But the matron only looked at them with something, almost like pity. Then she reached into her apron and pulled out 2 small black stones, placing one in each of their hands. The stones were warm. "You should keep these," she said softly, her voice calm in a way that made the hairs on Samuel's arms rise. "When the thaw comes, you'll want the ma to know your name." She turned away and blew out the candle. The room fell into darkness. In that moment, Samuel realized she wasn't going to punish them. She wanted them to know. She wanted them to be there. The offering of thaw wasn't something she was hiding from them anymore. It was an invitation. The days leading to the full moon felt like walking on the thin crust of a frozen pond, each step echoing with the threat of breaking through. The air had shifted again, warmer now, but close, almost damp, as if the walls themselves were sweating. Somewhere in the building, water dripped in an unbroken rhythm, a metronome counting down to something neither Samuel nor Margaret wanted to name aloud. Outside, the snow was gone. The pond lay exposed, its surface glassy, fragile, spider-webbed, with cracks that deepened daily. The children no longer played in the yard. They gathered in clusters near the windows, their breath fogging the glass, eyes fixed on the falling water as though awaiting an arrival. The matron moved through the halls with renewed energy. Her cheeks were flushed, her steps lighter, as if she had shed some hidden weight. She no longer tried to hide her rituals. She boiled dark herbs in the kitchen, the steam so bitter it stung Samuel's eyes. She burned strips of parchment in the hearth, the curling ashes bearing the same strange symbols he'd seen in the basement. Every night she wore the iron key around her neck, resting her palm against it as though feeling for a pulse. Samuel and Margaret met in stolen moments, whispering in corners, planning. But planning for what? They couldn't run. The nearest town was days away on foot, and the matron seemed to anticipate their every move. Nor could they speak to the others. Most of the children had sunk into a silent obedience, their minds somewhere far beyond reach. Even those who might still be thinking clearly avoided eye contact, as though afraid recognition itself was dangerous. It was Margaret who suggested the basement again. "The ma," she said quietly one morning, "it's not just under the orphanage. Those tunnels on the map, maybe one leads out. If we find it before the full moon, we might get away." That night, while the matron was in the kitchen, they slipped back into the cellar. The air was colder there, but tinged with an earthy rot, as though the thaw above was seeping into the ground. The red door was unlocked, just as before. They descended into the tunnel, lantern in hand. The carved walls glistened with condensation, the symbols damp and glimmering like fresh paint. The passage forked in several places, each branch marked by a different sigil. Samuel recognized one from the map, a symbol for mouth. They followed it. The air grew warmer as they went, the stone underfoot softening into soil. And then, ahead, a faint sound breathing. Not the slow, steady draw of a person, but something larger, deeper, each inhale carrying the weight of shifting. Earth. They rounded a bend and stopped. The tunnel ended in a cavern, the walls pulsing faintly as though alive. In the center was a hole perfectly circular, wider than a cart, its edges slick and black. The air above it shimmered with heat, though the smell that rose from it was sharp, metallic, and old. Margaret grabbed Samuel's arm. "We have to go back," she whispered, though the sound seemed swallowed instantly, as if the cavern itself drank her words. They turned, but the matron was standing in the tunnel behind them, the iron key in her hand. The children from the orphanage were with her, their faces pale and blank, eyes fixed not on Samuel or Margaret, but on the hole. The matron stepped aside, gesturing toward the cavern. "The thaw is here," she said softly. "It is time to feed the maw." Samuel's lantern flickered, and in that brief stutter of light, he saw movement in the blackness of the hole, not a shape, but the suggestion of one. Something shifting, just beneath the surface, waiting. They had no weapons, no allies, and no clear path out. The tunnels branched endlessly behind them, but every branch seemed to breathe the same heavy, hungry air. The matron began to hum the same low, vibrating sound Samuel had heard in the walls for months. The children joined in, their voices rising and falling like waves. The heat from the hole intensified, pressing against his skin. Margaret's grip on his arm tightened. "If we stay," she murmured, "we're part of it. If we run?" She didn't finish the thought. There might be no if left. And then, from deep within the maw, something answered the hum. The sound rose from the depths, like a shudder through the bones of the earth, a resonance too low to be a voice, too deep to belong to anything human. The cavern walls seemed to tighten around it, the symbols on the stone pulsing in time with each note. The air grew hot enough to sting Samuel's skin, and his lantern, still clutched in one trembling hand, guttered under the pressure of something unseen. The matron stepped forward, her shadow stretching long across the floor until it seemed to crawl to the lip of the hole. She held the iron key high above her head, the bone beads clacking softly against each other. In the other hand, she carried one of the small vials Samuel had seen in her desk. A cloudy liquid inside caught the faint glow of the cavern and swirled lazily, almost alive. "This is the last of the season," she murmured, though she wasn't speaking to the children or to Samuel and Margaret. She tipped the vial into the hole. The liquid didn't fall so much as it was drawn down, disappearing instantly into the blackness. The hum from the maw deepened, shifting from a single note into something almost like a sigh. The children began, moving forward, one by one, their bare feet silent on the damp stone. Their faces were still blank, their eyes glassy, their hands hanging limp at their sides. The matron's hum guided them, her voice steady, each note vibrating in Samuel's. Teeth. Margaret took a step backward, pulling Samuel with her. The tunnel behind them was a maze, but it was the only chance they had. They moved slowly at first, trying not to draw attention. But when the first child reached the lip of the maw and stood motionless at its edge, something in Samuel broke, grabbed Margaret's hand, and ran. The hum faltered for just a moment. Then the matron's voice rose sharply, slicing through the air like a whip crack. The children in the tunnel turned as one, their eyes finding Samuel and Margaret in the flicker of the lantern light. They ran faster, the carved walls flashing past in a blur of symbols. The air in the tunnels seemed to fight them, growing thick and warm, dragging at their legs. Behind them, footsteps began to echo many footsteps, steady and unhurried, as though their pursuers knew there was nowhere to go. They took turn after turn, the walls closing in, until at last the passage narrowed to a slit barely wide enough to squeeze through. They pressed themselves sideways, the stone scraping their arms, and emerged into a smaller chamber. Here, the air was cooler. Water dripped from the ceiling into a shallow pool, its surface rippling in the lantern light. Across the pool, barely visible, was a gap in the stone a way out. They waded through, the water biting cold, the lantern held high. The stone floor on the other side sloped upward, the air growing fresher with each step. And then moonlight. They stumbled into the forest beyond the orphanage grounds, the trees skeletal and silver under the full moon. The cold air burned their lungs, but it was clean, real. Behind them, from deep underground, came a sound that made the earth tremble. It was not the hum. It was something larger and awakening. Margaret turned to Samuel, her face pale but steady. "It's not over," she said. "We just delayed it." From somewhere far off, a bell rang, the same iron toll Samuel had heard months ago, when the winter first closed in. Only now, it was not a warning. It was a promise. The Bellhouse Orphanage still stood in the distance, dark against the trees. And beneath it, the Ma waited, patient as stone, because the thaw always comes. And when it does, it always hungers.